don't think there's a God, you're mentioned in God's word because he's accounted for you, knew you're coming, and he's put you in his book, and he said, the fool has said in his heart there's no God. The big thing is there any evidence? Now, I've got a young man here in a minute whose name is Barry, and if you want to take a stride in, you'll hear his story in 2 minutes' time. But look, you be the jury, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just simply going to ask the question, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Okay? Now, in order for a man to rise from the dead, he's got to have been dead. Do you agree? What do you think, sir? Does that make sense to your logical brain?
Yeah.
In order for a man to rise from the dead, he's got to have been dead. Okay, you get it? Now, in order for a man to rise from the dead, he's got to have been. Are you with it? Do you agree? Does anybody disagree? So, the question is there an historical person called Jesus? Ready? Now, I'm going to your side if you're not a Christian. And your side tells me Justin Martyr, Lucian, Barnabas Sarapyri, Cornelius, Flavus Josephus, and Phallus. That is the history department of the world. Just let that man listen. Just let that man listen. Lewis, I'm going to the history department of the world and look at the history department, non-Christian, not my side, your side if you're not a Christian. So don't tell me there is no evidence for Jesus. All them historical writers have written on the life of Jesus. It's not the historical department that's throwing out Jesus. Okay? Now, second thing is this. Jesus said he would rise. So we're asking the question, did he rise from the dead? He said he would rise. There's not too many people rising from the dead, ladies and gentlemen, but Jesus said he'd do it. You consider the evidence and you see what you think at the end of the evidence. All right? So he said he'd rise, and that's where he lived. And if you really don't believe me, this has got to be the most boring document I've ever seen, but it's very important. All right? It's not your life story, it's actually the history of Great Britain. And if you work through, you get all the different kings and queens, and at the bottom you'll get two initials, JC, standing for Julius Caesar. I knew you knew that. And also standing for Jesus Christ. So we know that Jesus showed up. Now, does anybody want to disagree with that? A fella stood here, he must have been 60, and he said, you've no evidence. Well, what he really meant was, I've not considered the evidence. That's what he really meant, but I have made my own conclusion. So, Jesus came, it's a fact, and he said he would rise from the dead. Now, think about it. When Jesus was crucified, they shoved a spear eventually through his ticker, through his heart, and blood and water came out. That means within seconds he was dead. And then they put him in a cold tomb, and they thought that was the end of him. But remember, Jesus said he would come out. Now, think about it for a second. Here's my question to you. Here it is. This is the big question you've got to answer if you don't think Jesus came out. That's the question there. Who's got his body? There's no body being produced yet. So where did his body go to? Because we know the tomb was empty. So my question to you, if you're a thinking person, a rational person, rather than one of these pea-brains who just says there's no evidence, think about it for yourself, folks. I'm not here to shape your thinking. You've got a brain. Think about it for yourself. We know this. The history of England says at the bottom, Jesus Christ showed up. Does anybody not believe that Henry VIII turned up? We might wish he never turned up, especially if you're one of his wives. But here we go, folks. He turned up. He's on the list. And when we get to the bottom, does anybody not believe that Julius Caesar showed up? Well, you're not going to get your GCSE in history if you believe that, are you? Ladies and gentlemen, the fact is, a man in history called Jesus turned up. That's all I'm saying. Can anybody disagree with that? Thank you very much, madam. Now, the second thing is this. He turns up and he says he'll rise from the dead. Now, if a man's going to rise from the dead, he's got to have lived and he's got to have died. But here's the question to you. Who's got his body? Now, Jesus said, I'm coming out. He said, I'm coming out after 3 days, I'm going to blow the place apart. That's what he said. The question is, who had his body? Now, I'll tell you who had an interest in his body. You've got the disciples. They didn't have his body. I'll tell you in a minute why. You've got the Jews. They didn't have his body. And you've got these wicked people with the leaders of the Jews at the time, the Romans. Now, you think about it. You've got a sealed tomb with cement on it, with a Roman seal. If you break that seal, you die. You've got a guard of about 15 people, professional murderers, looking after the tomb. All of a sudden, they've scarpered, and we also know the tomb is empty. Now, think about it. If the disciples had the body and stood up in the middle of Jerusalem, which they did, and said, this Jesus, I'm now quoting Peter, the lead disciple, this Jesus you crucified, God has raised up, but they've got the body in the garage. Why would 11 out of 12 of them give their lives, knowing they've got the body, standing up saying, this Jesus you crucified, God has raised up, and the brothers say, if you say that again, we'll kill you. Well, you can say that, sir, but your life view won't challenge this. Now listen, ask your question. Why would disciples give their lives for a lie? But they knew it was a lie. In the Twin Towers, them guys flew those planes thinking they were pleasing the God at the other side. But they didn't know. But if you've got the body and you stand up and say, Jesus is alive, and give your life on that, it's nutty, innit? It's absurdity. It's throwing your brains entirely away because you've got the body. And that's why you know them men didn't have the body. Now, these Jews didn't have the body, and I'll tell you why the Jews didn't have the body, because for 33 years they wanted Jesus in the grave. Why would they suddenly want him out after 24 hours? They wanted him in, didn't they? They paid Judas to find out which one it was to kiss. They were ones who decided the silver pieces, weren't they? They wanted him in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Jews would never touch a dead body at the Passover. So when the Passover was on, the Jews would never touch a dead body. And that's why at the trial, the Jews stopped when they came to a place called the Praetorium, because that was a Gentile court, and that's where Jesus went with the Romans. Jews wouldn't go near. So they're not going to pick up a dead body. Now let me ask you this question. If you were asked to nick a corpse, would you nick it naked, with all its blood and gore from a crucifixion, or would you nick it clothed? What would you nick it with? You'd nick it clothed, wouldn't you? Why were the grave clothes in the grave? Why did they unwrap them? Think about it. You see, folks, you live in a society where you watch a TV, and the mind behind the TV is atheistic. And that's why you go to school and you're told you come from an animal, but when you apply your thinking to the historical facts that we put in on here, you think, oh, never thought of that, and I did the same. So I'm saying to you, the disciples couldn't possibly have the body of Jesus. And the Jews didn't have it because they won't touch a dead body at a Passover. And I know why the Romans didn't have it, because they didn't even wheel it on. So if this is not Southport but Jerusalem, and I'm not Vinny, I'm Peter, and I say, this Jesus you crucified, God has raised him up, look at, we're all witnesses, and then you go, Peter, nah, here comes the body. Why didn't they do it? Because there was nobody there in the tomb. You see, folks, it's not evidence you need, it's honesty. That fellow who was stood here telling us no evidence, I want to know, is he a drunkard? Is he a liar? No liar will enter heaven, says the last page in the Bible book 1. You're not getting anywhere near heaven. And when that vicar tells you you've been an ass man in the box, I'll be stood there thinking, don't tell me a load of rubbish, because Jesus said the soul that sins it will surely die. That person in that box is not going anywhere near heaven. And neither are you. And that's why there's a cross on Calvary, because Jesus knows on the cross of Calvary is your only hope. If you walk from here, you'll get an even stricter judgment, because you're ignoring the love of Jesus on Calvary. It's true, isn't it, folks? And Jesus came into the world to hang on a cross for you. His blood was shed for you. And people, sinners, can come and be forgiven, because the risen Jesus changes lives. Here's my evidence. My friend Barry's agreed to be interviewed. Barry, now Barry don't speak too loud, but he's a Burnley man. Barry, are you more than 40 years of age?
Just a little bit.
Okay. Now Barry, have you been a Christian very long?
I've been a Christian since 1987.
Okay, now I'm looking for people who are atheists, because how are you going to explain this story? Barry, will you promise the atheists, or anybody listening, or anybody who's into atheist religion, and anybody who's a Mooney or a loony, or anybody else out there listening, will you promise us that you won't tell any lies?
Okay, I promise, yeah.
Can you say that a bit louder?
Yes, I promise. I won't tell any
So
lies.
this man has promised, whatever I asked him, not to tell you a lie. Okay, ready? Barry, my first question is this. Have you met, I'll say it in English, have you met the risen Jesus?
Yeah.
Can you say that again in English?
Yes, I have.
Has he changed your life?
Yes, he has changed my life.
Now folks, how do you explain this, man? What age were you, Barry?
So I was 21 when I became a Christian.
Okay.
I wasn't an atheist. I always believed in God, but I wasn't forgiven.
So you are saying, Barry, that when you were 21, what did you hear that changed your life, Barry?
I just simply heard the gospel that Jesus came to this earth to die for my sin, that he rose from the dead and he could forgive me. And I didn't understand it, but I was interested. I wanted to be forgiven.
And you got forgiven?
And I got forgiven.
Barry, I know you live in another country, you live in Nicaragua for most of your life, but let's say you died today. Now remember, you've got to tell us the truth. Your body would hit the floor, but where would Barry Davis be?
I know for sure that I would go to heaven. I don't deserve it, but I've got the confidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we're saying is, look, it doesn't matter what you've done. God only came for sinners. There's loads of people too good for him. He only needs sinners. He came into the world to save Barry's and me. We've done wrong. What if he said to you, be good and I'll forgive you? How many good things you have to do? You wouldn't work it out, would you? But Jesus Christ shed his blood on Calvary's cross for your sin. He's the Lamb of God. He takes away the sin of the world. He's taken Barry's sin and he's taken my sin. Now let's just pretend for a minute there's a weighing scale here and I put it on -6. And I ask you to stand on the weighing scale. And there you are, 27 stone of you, Billy Three Bellies. And you stand on there and I say, you're only 21 stone. Or I put another one who's 6 stone. Oh, you're really thin, you. Would the flattery do him any good? No. What he needs is truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus tells you beyond the grave there's an eternal death. People who go beyond the grave outside of Jesus, listen, I am in torment in this flame. That's what they say. I am in torment in this flame. There's no rest in peace. It's the lie of the devil. He's lied since the Garden of Eden. He said to Adam and Eve, you shall not die. Jesus says, the soul that sins shall die. Millions believe the devil that you're safe. You should not sleep tonight if you're not a Christian, because the wrath of God is on you, and Jesus says, I can forgive you. If you want to carry on, look at whether the wrath of God's on. Look in the mirror. You've gone wrinkly. Death is on you. There's a sentence of death on you and me. And it's the cross of Calvary that takes your death. And Jesus can forgive you. Now, I'm not after your vote, you'll know that within a minute. But I am after making sure you're safe forever. And if you're not forgiven, Barry at 21 is my evidence, becomes a Christian. Where were you when it happened to you, Barry?
I was in Burnley where I was living, in my own home, and I just prayed. And it was the first time I'd ever prayed, and I just said, God, if you are real, if you died for my sin, I want forgiveness. I want you to come into my life and change me. And my life changed. It didn't change instantly, but I've never been the same.
Now, my last thing to say is this. Everybody knows round here Mark Lawrence. He lives in Birkdale. He was a centre-half for Liverpool. You know, he was on telly one day, and a doctor who supported Liverpool was watching the telly. And he sent a message to the BBC, and he says, tell Mark Lawrence to get to the doctors quickly and have that mark on his cheek checked out. And Mark Lawrence went to the doctors, and the doctors said, he's got cancer. And Lawrence had his cancer cut out, and the BBC put Lawrence and the doctor back on the telly, and this is what Mark said, this man is my friend, because he told me I had a problem, and I've done something about it. Doesn't love warn. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we speak about sin. And Jesus says, I love you, I'll forgive you, I'll cleanse you, I'll give you hope and peace. And the risen Jesus, who's not in a grave, you can meet. Barry's met him, I've met him, you can meet him too. I'm going to offer to anybody a little Gospel of John. They're just there, Barry, if you dig them out there. And if anybody listening would like to take it and read it. Now, folks, if you get the Southport Visitor, let me tell you this. I have never read the Southport Visitor, but it's a load of garbage. Do not buy it. Is that fair to the editor? No, it's not. And if the editor was here, he'd probably fill me in. Because he'll say, you shouldn't say that because you've not read it. Folks, when you say there's no evidence for Jesus, have you read anything? This book is written that you might know that you have eternal life. Thank you for listening. God bless you. Come and take one from my hand. If you'd like one, just take it and read it, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Adam, would you like?